I'm a sucker for these topics. Why oligarchy falls and how to speed it up. Just get it over with, you know? I don't even know if this video is about the US, because in the US you could claim that it's a plutocracy where it's a government by the wealthy. But hey, let's see how we can just make things go a bit faster. How about that, huh?
They control the wealth, they control the laws, and they control the system, but they can't control everything forever. In our previous exploration of oligarchy, Aristotle uncovered how the wealthy few don't just influence society, but shape its very foundations.
Sure.
That video resonated with over 1 million people across the entire political spectrum, from every corner of the world. Why? Because based on the comment section, they felt this is happening in their own nations.
Yeah.
A few powerful people controlling not just wealth, but the fundamental rules that govern our lives. But there's something we didn't cover in that video. Hidden in Aristotle's Politics lies something more. His writing did not just reveal how oligarchies work. He also discovered something that should make every tyrant and oligarch nervous. These systems that seem invincible often follow patterns of decline. And when they appear strongest, when their control seems absolute, that's often when they're most vulnerable. Aristotle mapped out when and how these moments of vulnerability emerge. What makes some attempts at...
Let's hear it from the ancient, legendary knowledge havers.
...change succeed while others fail. And most crucially, how to ensure that when change comes, it leads to one of the so-called true regime forms, rather than something even worse. So I thought it'd be interesting to break down Aristotle's implied blueprint for ending oligarchies. We'll discover how to recognize these critical moments of opportunity, why timing matters more than strength, and most importantly, how to avoid the traps that have doomed many attempts at change. Change is coming. It always does. The question isn't if, but when, what comes next, and how to impact that.
I think a lot of people feel that at the moment, in which case they feel something is wrong in the country they live in, and it just hasn't been changing for a while, but at the moment it's at its peak of corruption, or it just isn't getting any better, and people are really thinking, what's next? And a lot of that comes with the loss of hope, and what do we do? What's it gonna be once everything is over? So these topics, man, these are thirst traps for me.
First, let's remind ourselves that Aristotle wasn't theorizing about political change from some abstract position. He tutored powerful leaders like Alexander the Great, and he studied over 150 different Greek city-states and foreign regimes. As both a philosopher and an empirical observer, he noticed patterns repeating throughout history, and these patterns reveal something valuable about how power changes hands. Many feel that the best, no, the only way to end an oppressive regime is through open revolution, but Aristotle found something much more complex. When studying countless political transformations, he noticed that the most aggressive revolutions often produce the worst outcomes. Take Syracuse under Dionysius. The dramatic overthrow led by Dion promised liberation, but ultimately created an even more oppressive system. The revolutionary had rallied the people with visions of freedom, only to deliver another form of tyranny. And we've seen many such cases in recent history too. This is why Aristotle advocated for gradual reform rather than violent upheaval. In Politics, he writes that changes in government should not be attempted at once, but rather by small degrees, warning that those who lead a successful revolution will gain all the power of the state for themselves.
It's a very interesting take, because there is that idea that when you get as far as we've gotten at this point, you just want to, some people just want to burn everything down, right? That's the idea. And
Aristotle, the continued stability of the political system was essential, not just for order's sake, but because stable systems allowed for the kind of incremental improvements that could enhance citizens' lives without risking catastrophic collapse. Most of the successful political transformations he studied were ones where people barely realized they were happening until they were done. But that perspective presents a significant issue, because this led him to focus mostly on gradual top-down reforms by those already within the spheres of power. But what if you're not part of the ruling class, or even ruling class adjacent? Of course, you could attempt to become a reforming part of the oligarchy yourself, which is not necessarily a bad strategy. But when that's not possible, what are you supposed to do then? Just wait and hope for benevolent reforms from above?
That's how a lot of people
This
feel.
is where we
I'm
need to
sure.
go a bit beyond what Aristotle explicitly said by reading somewhat between the lines while still adhering to his analysis. During his studies,
All right, look, please slaughter me in the comments, okay? But the type of corruption and how embedded it is at this point, it feels like it's harder to get into it to do any change than it might have been in the past. Again, slaughter me in the comments, it's okay, but it's difficult to tell a layman like myself we should do incremental changes when it feels like every time you've been trying to vote for something or trying to make a change in some sense, it doesn't feel like anything's going anywhere or it's getting worse. And so the motivation to continue doing it in this way is also a consideration. Do we have enough motivation to keep going if you don't see any change actually happening, even no matter how small, right? I don't know. Right now in the US, it's a great example. There are some good things happening. A lot of fraud being figured out through financial fraud, things like that, money being sent all over the place for the weirdest reasons. These are great. And these are not even small changes, but they are in some sense small considered how bad the whole thing is. These are great things. And I think a lot of people find some more hope or motivation to see if it could be taken the whole way through. But overall, as they call it, the swamp being drained, that's just not happened yet. And then as a layman, an average person in life, you're just hoping that someone in some sense makes a change. But this is obviously the worst stance to take. The one where you do nothing and just hope that someone else does something. It is, in the end, not a good one.
Aristotle noticed something curious about power. He saw that
That's not to say I don't do it, okay? I'm not trying to, again, no blame.
political systems tended to move through distinct phases, each with their own characteristics and vulnerabilities. What he observed was subtle but important. Political systems don't just change randomly, but they're not mechanically predictable either. Instead, they tend to face specific types of decay that can be reversed or accelerated by human action. For example, a monarchy turns into a tyranny when the ruler starts prioritizing self-interest over the common good.
Sure.
A polity risks degradation to democracy when it caters to the immediate desires of the masses rather than the long-term good of society. And an aristocracy often drifts toward oligarchy when the elite become consumed by greed rather than merit and virtue. Aristotle argued that these corrupted forms of government are even less stable than their good counterparts because they are fundamentally unjust. Tyrannies are inherently fragile because they rely on force and lack the support of the people. Over time, the ruler's abuses lead to resistance, rebellion, or assassination. And democracies are almost as unstable because they lack the guiding principles of justice and virtue. This reveals
That's
a crucial pattern. What those in power do to make their power absolute often end up making it more fragile. When they silence opposition, they isolate themselves and lose vital feedback about what's happening in society.
Yeah, you stand at the top with no one to actually tell you what's going on, and there you go. You have no true response to what you're doing, which in turn creates enough hatred that you don't even see anymore, and eventually it'll topple you.
When they hoard wealth,
Speaking as if I have my own kingdom here at home, you know? As if I can see something like that.
create resentment and alternative power centers, and when they eliminate rivals, they destroy the very institutions that could help stabilize their rule. While dismantling institutions may provide short-term control, it removes the foundations for sustainable governance, leaving the regime vulnerable to collapse or external threats. And that leads to an exciting revelation. If political systems tend to face predictable challenges, and if certain actions create specific weaknesses in that system, then that allows us to identify when a corrupt system is vulnerable to change. And perhaps even more importantly, you can recognize what kind of actions are more likely to succeed at different moments. This isn't deterministic prophecy, of course, but Aristotle saw these tendencies play out again and again, and while no two situations are identical, the underlying dynamics of power, how it concentrates, how it corrupts, and how it potentially transforms, do follow recognizable patterns. And it's these patterns we need to understand if we want to see how and when change becomes possible. And just like all the other regime types, oligarchies have their own life cycles and fragilities. Think about how wealth becomes political power. It starts subtly. A few successful individuals or families begin shaping things in their favor. Maybe it's through campaign contributions, media ownership, or funding think tanks. They don't usually stage a coup. Instead, they play a longer game. Year by year, they indirectly shape tax policies, regulations, and market rules until their advantages become self-reinforcing. Their wealth buys influence, and that influence helps them accumulate more wealth.
Well, this is exactly what the US feels like for a lot of Americans, no? This is exactly describing what's going on here. The only issue is that there's a sense of hope that must be placed on the fact that the new administration might actually be making a change or simply showing us a new method, but with the same hidden intentions. That's what's difficult to recognize. And right now, the left and the right, so divisive. So whatever you say about either one, the other one's going to hate you. There's no form of unity.
Then comes the consolidation phase. The rules themselves begin to transform. What started as informal influence gets encoded into law. Think about how seemingly neutral technical adjustments to campaign rules, corporate structures, tax frameworks, and so on slowly reshape the playing field.
Everyone's too old in
Each
politics.
change appears small and sometimes even reasonable in isolation. A tweak here, an adjustment there. But step back and look at the whole picture. These individual changes form an architecture of power, each piece reinforcing the others.
That's why it's so difficult to dismantle. There's too many things. You take one away and 40 other things are going to be angry with you, right? That's the difficult
But over
part.
time, these regimes enter what we could call a degeneration phase.
There you go.
Think about what happens when any
this.
group or individual becomes too comfortable in a position of power. At first, they try to justify their privileges, they're job creators, they do it for the people, they are saving the economy, think of the children, and so on. But gradually something shifts. The justifications become thinner, more perfunctory.
Yeah.
Eventually, they stop bothering to justify at all.
Yeah.
Public resources become their personal piggy bank, public institutions their private toolset, and public concerns are barely worth acknowledging.
That's the thing. When there's not enough consequence for an action by a politician or a law in some sense, it just gets worse and worse. It's a reason why the public must stand for their own rights, right? And we're all at fault for it. Another one is, I love the idea of degeneracy becoming prevalent in some sense. My biggest outlook was the West is experiencing a moment of immorality. Nothing to guide it. Nothing to say that, hey, this might not be the thing that makes the most money perhaps, but it brings the most justice for all in some sense, or the most morality. It's the most moral thing to do. And a lot of these things have been lost. And you see it in companies themselves, where they're willing to fire 4,000 people and hire 4,000 people with, for example, H-1B visas, where they can pay them less and have them work more hours because they're stuck to this condition that they must work hard to be able to stay in the U.S. In this example, the U.S., right? But this can be applied to many things. But it really is just a case of immorality. At what point do we stand up for some form of integrity? Something that's beyond just the bottom line or profit. And that goes in our own lives and in corporations and in politics. That has been my thing. So I guess it's the same as the degeneracy phase, which is a disgusting one.
This is exactly when they look strongest on the surface. They've got everything under their control. The money, the power, the institutions. Look at how the 30 tyrants controlled Athens. They had all the weapons, all the wealth, total formal authority. They thought they were showing strength by ruthlessly eliminating critics, hoarding wealth, and crushing dissent. Yet they were creating the perfect conditions for their own overthrow. What makes this pattern so important is how it reveals the paradox of power, strength becoming weakness, control breeding its own instability. When those in charge respond to challenges by becoming more controlling, they often accelerate their own decline. Their harsh policies alienate potential allies. Their visible excesses create silent resentment. Their internal rivalries fracture their unity. Think of it like holding sand. The tighter you squeeze, the more it slips through your fingers. The more they crush dissent, the more they create the conditions for their own undoing. They lose touch with reality. lose critical feedback, lose the legitimate authority that originally let them govern.
Yeah, this guy's a poet, huh? Did I show you the channel, by the way? It's called Legendary Lore. Yeah, I'm sure you saw it.
It's not that they become weak.
Great.
They still have all the surface power, but they become brittle. And that brittleness, more than any external enemy, is what ultimately threatens their rule. But perhaps most importantly for those watching closely, this pattern reveals moments of opportunity for the oppressed. Because understanding these phases is not just about predicting decline, it's about recognizing opportunities. Each phase has its own vulnerabilities, its own pressure points, and its own possibilities for transformation. And this brings us to the crucial question. How do you recognize when a system is entering its vulnerable phases? What subtle signs signal that change might be possible? Because, as Aristotle observed, timing often matters more than strength. So how do we know when change is nigh for oligarchy, specifically? Aristotle observed several critical indicators that often converge to create what we could call a perfect storm. The first sign is perhaps the most obvious, yet often misunderstood. When public dissatisfaction flares up, it's not really the volume of complaints that matters, it's their nature. The oligarchs can handle protests against a new tax on farmland. They can manage complaints about inflation. And they love when isolated issues like minimum wages or subsidies release some pent-up steam. But Aristotle observed that while a state can handle many types of protests, the real danger comes when people stop believing the state serves its proper end, the good life and virtue of its citizens. So when protests shift...
when you completely give up on it's almost like you pretend they don't even exist anymore. They've never had your interests at heart, or that's what you believe at this point, and you just think, you know what, I don't even care. And you start thinking in a different way entirely. It's a mindset change, right?
Shift from specific grievances to fundamental questions of justice. Not just, is this fair, but is our whole system serving its purpose? That's when things are about to boil over. This total erosion of legitimacy typically happens in three distinct but interconnected ways. First, while Aristotle recognized the importance of private property, he warned against the wealthy treating common things as their own, like when public spaces become effectively private, when shared infrastructure serves only elite interests, when common goods like water and, in our times, airwaves and digital networks become de facto personal property of the economic political class. Second, Aristotle was particularly concerned when the laws and customs that the oligarchs themselves established start being ignored whenever convenient. They impose austerity on the masses while they themselves live in luxury. They praise competition until they need to crush rivals. They talk about innovation while blocking new ideas that might threaten their position. As Aristotle noted, this hypocrisy undermines the very foundation of law, which should apply equally to all. Third, and perhaps most fundamentally, when rulers become disconnected from the virtues and values they're supposed to exemplify. Aristotle believed that legitimate rule required not just wealth or power, but moral excellence. If oligarchs from their isolated positions push radical social transformations while being entirely disconnected from their impacts on ordinary communities, if they advocate for fundamental changes to how people live, work, and raise their children, all while being insulated from the consequences of these changes, they hold in contempt the very cultural...
This is the shit that changed it for many people. So if you want to be trans, that's all you. But starting to teach it to kids, things like this, that was crazy.
Traditions and social bonds that most communities consider essential to their way of life. The gap becomes no longer just economic, but moral and cultural. This triple erosion of public resources, of rules for thee, not for me, and of shared cultural values, creates a fundamental crisis of legitimacy.
It's probably the UK.
But the thing is, Aristotle observed that public dissatisfaction alone rarely triggers change. What makes a moment truly critical is when it combines with internal division among the ruling class itself. While studying different city-states, he noticed that oligarchies often fall not from external pressure, but from disputes among those in power. For example, between different business interests, preventing them from presenting a united front. When oligarchs start infighting over market regulations or resource control, they create openings they'd never allow if united. And the final crucial sign of changing winds is the emergence of new leaders and voices, but not always where you'd expect. The crucial voices often don't come from traditional opposition. They come from entrepreneurs who've built independent economic power, from respected professionals who've stayed above factional disputes, and from people who can bridge different social classes and interest groups. Crucially, Aristotle observed that change leading to a more just system, rather than change to some other oligarchy or tyranny, must involve the middle class. Positive change has to come through those who occupy a middle position between extremes of wealth and poverty, those who have enough property to be independent, but not so much as to be corrupted by luxury. What makes the middle class effective is their ability to combine virtue with practical wisdom. They aren't typically the most radical voices calling for revolution, nor are they part of the established oligarchy. Instead, they are ordinary people who understand both what is good and what is possible, a combination Aristotle saw as essential for any meaningful political change. Most importantly,
I don't think that's a super interesting take. Oh my goodness, I messed it up. That's a super interesting take, because when you understand both what is possible and, it's basically you're not unrealistic, right? You understand that change requires effort. You understand that freedom requires effort. A lot of people have this idea of freedom, right? We just want a government that gives us freedom. Makes no sense. There's no such utopia. Every goodness comes with some form of effort to rid yourself of whatever's bad. It's just in simple terms, right? Let's find out where the hell we went. Somewhere over here.
Than Aristotle saw as essential for any meaningful political change. Most importantly, leaders representing the middle class succeed because they understand what Aristotle considered the true purpose of the state. Not just stability or wealth, but the good life that comes through the practice of virtue.
Yeah.
So how does this help us understand when and how to act? Interpreting Aristotle's observations suggests a few crucial approaches. First, build alternative sources of power. They don't need to, and probably shouldn't, be direct confrontations with oligarchic authority. Instead, focus on creating independent economic networks, developing new technologies, or establishing cultural institutions that operate outside traditional power structures. Think of it as building a parallel system rather than directly confronting the existing one.
This is almost like my argument is government should be small, in any case. And this is some form of idea of this, in which you don't need government for everything. You should be doing some of the things on your own ground, just so that you have the power if anything gets corrupted in one system. So there are many other systems that can keep going without that form of corruption. And so the corruption can be rooted out in one area. But if that thing controls everything, then rooting out the corruption in that massive thing which controls everything is ultimately more difficult. So
this is exactly what emerging merchant classes did in many Greek cities, gradually accumulating influence through trade networks that the traditional power base couldn't control as easily.
Yeah.
Second, form intentional coalitions, but not the kind you might imagine. Successful challenges to entrenched power rarely come from single interest groups. Instead, effective transformations happen when different people find common cause. Consider how in many Greek city-states, the emerging commercial class often allied with small farmers against the traditional landed upper class. Today, this could, for example, mean bringing together tech innovators frustrated by monopolistic practices, traditional businesses, and middle-class citizens seeking economic stability and a normal life. Third, understand and exploit system weaknesses. When oligarchies abuse their power, they create openings. Think about it this way. Every time oligarchs break their own stated principles, they create what we might call legitimacy gaps, or a discrepancy between the expectations of how leaders should act.
That's one day of Taylor Swift. Is that what
and
they
how
say?
They actually act. The key is matching your response to their specific contradictions. When they champion meritocracy while practicing nepotism, document and publicize clear cases of unearned privilege. When they compromise courts, utilize dispute resolution systems. When they preach free markets but practice monopoly, rally the natural coalition of small business owners crushed by unfair competition and consumers tired of inflated prices. Your responses should not only challenge existing power, but demonstrate a better way forward. Turn their contradictions into stepping stones toward positive change. Each of these compensating moves creates new vulnerabilities, new contradictions, and new potential points of leverage. As Archimedes said, "Give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I shall move the world." Fourth, and this is crucial, develop political virtue. It's not just about personal morality, it's about building the capacity for effective action. An oligarchy's greatest weakness often lies in its inability to generate genuine loyalty or collective purpose. They rule through power rather than legitimate authority. Your advantage is the ability to create genuine communities of interest and purpose. Last but perhaps most important, cultivate what we might call strategic patience. It's easy to swallow the proverbial black pill when things seem hopeless. But remember, oligarchies often appear strongest just before they begin to crack. Their very efforts to maintain absolute control frequently generate the conditions for their own transformation. Thank you for watching.
Ooh. Thank you, sir. Damn, that ending there was good, huh? It's always when it seems the darkest where things are about to change, for sure. I just know a lot of people feel like this at the moment. I mean, you see it in small instances where people they just don't care anymore. They just don't care. And that you can see it in forms of off-grid living, people just leaving entire countries to go live somewhere else on the planet. People are just so fed up and they don't see a change coming. At the same point, the difficulty is, although I see things hitting its peak, it feels like it's hitting its peak, that peak could last another 100 years. That's unknown, of course. But considering in today's age everything moves at such a much faster speed, I would imagine that it wouldn't take that long. I'm not here to make predictions, and because I have no idea, but I know that it just feels like we're due for a change. We're due for a new way of life, because whatever we've looked at in the past is just not what we have today. We have a whole new system we can work on. Everything's more efficient in some way. So what do we do here? You know? God damn, I forgot to turn this light on. Look at this. Look at the difference. Anyways, what do you think? You think it's about to end? You think it's about to change? What would you like to see? Which country are you even in? And how is it going over there?